the Italians were just seen as a problem upon a problem. They keep coming in. We can't stop them. By the 1910, there are immigration laws specifically written to keep Italians out of America. Those laws are still in place, but they are not targeting Italians anymore. They're targeting the new other. It's this revolving door of who's the new group that's coming in mass. It's not just, oh, there's a few people coming from Italy and we're worried. It's there are thousands of people coming every day from Italy and we're worried. Well, why are you worried?
You're listening to The Underview, an exploration in the shaping of our place. My name is Mike Rush, and today we enter the story of Italian immigration to Northwest Arkansas. It's a story of displacement and labor and resistance and a long struggle to belong. Our guest today is Emily Pianalto-Beshears, a descendant of one of the first Italian families who came to Arkansas in the late 1800s, and also the director of the Tontitown Historical Museum. This story begins in northern Italy with families seeking land and freedom and opportunity in a new world. That hope led them to the American South and to the cotton fields of Sunnyside Plantation in southeast Arkansas, where promises of property quickly gave way to a reality shaped by debt, racial hierarchy, and exploitation. Many didn't survive their time at Sunnyside, but some chose another path. Led by Father Pietro Bandini, a group of families left the Delta and journeyed north to the Rocky Hills of Washington County. There, they founded Tontitown, a place where they could protect their language and traditions, faith, and dignity. Through Emily's family memories and research, we begin to understand the layers of that story, how place was claimed and kept through music and architecture and kinship, but also how fragile it was, how easy immigrant histories can get erased or absorbed into a dominant narrative that often prefers nostalgia to truth. This is a conversation about power and place and the quiet work of remembrance. And before we begin, I do want to add one personal note. As I listened to Emily share her family story, I held it in tension with my own. And maybe some listening also share that same similar story. One of my great-great-grandfathers came to this country through Ellis Island in about 1872, an immigrant from Germany. I imagine he came for the same reasons as these Italian families: hope, land, and survival. But his story ended differently. He folded into society, absorbed into the promise of America in a way that others were not. And I'm still asking, what made that difference? Why was one group of Europeans given a path, while another was made to walk through cotton fields and prove that they belong? This episode won't give us all the answers, but it does invite us to ask better questions about who gets to belong and why. All right, a lot to get through today. Let's get into it. Well, I have a privilege this morning of sharing a space with Emily Pianalto-Beshears, who is in charge of the Tontitown Historical Museum, and probably most importantly is a descendant of the first wave of Tontitown settlers and immigrants that came to the space. And so, Emily, thanks for sitting with me. Welcome to the conversation.
Yeah, happy to be here.
We're here this morning to hear your story, and not only your story, but the story of a people that came to this place. So I'm going to defer to you in your vast expertise on where you want to start. But maybe we can place us within who you are and your connection to this story.
So I am I guess would be considered a fourth generation descendant. My great-grandfather came to America as a young child. He was born in Italy in the early 1880s. He was born in 1882. And his father and mother were the adults in the situation. His father got a hold of this contract from a Sunnyside company in southeast Arkansas and saw this as a great opportunity to give his sons and his children a better opportunity. Where they were coming from in northern Italy, they were living in a house, a 4-story house, with his 3 younger brothers, their wives, their children, and their unmarried sisters and their parents. Only 3 stories of the house were livable. The bottom story was for the animals. They all worked on the same farm that was very landlocked. They were up in the Alps, and they would keep hogs, chickens, things like that. But predominantly, they worked on the farm. They farmed corn. They didn't farm wheat up there. So when I tell people that pasta was not a staple, like spaghetti was not served daily in northern Italy, they're shocked. They're shocked when we talk about the polenta being what they ate in the early years of Tontitown, and spaghetti was not a factor because they didn't make it at home. But anyway, they're in northern Italy. They're landlocked. There's no inheritance. So if you have multiple children, multiple sons, the oldest gets the land. The younger ones are just off to fend for themselves. And so Domenico, my great-great-grandfather, was looking at this contract saying, man, this is an opportunity to give my sons land, like more land than what they could have now. So he and 2 of his 3 brothers decided they're signing the contract and heading to Southeast Arkansas. They left early November 1895. And Domenico, his trade in Italy, he was a teacher. He taught Italian, Latin, grammar, arithmetic. That's what he did during the day, and then he farmed at night. He was also in the military. He was a high-ranking Italian official for about 10 years of his life. And so he didn't start a family until he was in like his late 30s. That was very typical because mandatory military service, it was required in Italy. You didn't have a choice. You also didn't have a choice if you were a peasant, you worked for the aristocracy. That was still very much what their life was like. So the freedoms that America offered were vast. They get here on the ship voyage over. His younger brother, Dionisio, lost his youngest son. So they arrive with already 1 less of their family members. They're on the plantation, and he wrote about the voyage. We have his actual writings that survived over 150 odd years. And he talks about the voyage. He talks about getting to Sunnyside, and there's hope in that last line where he talks about everything they promised us is here. They had a house. Each family had a house. Very different than back in Italy where you're sharing a house with all of your siblings. Each sibling had a house right next door to each other. They had room. They thought, this is great. It's exactly what we were promised. And then it all falls apart.
Maybe before we get to that part, tell me, how does this story connect with you maybe today? Obviously, you have a role to preserve the history of this place, but this is not some abstract history. This is your own personal family history. How do you navigate between those 2 realities?
Well, whenever I'm giving a tour in here, I do really bring in my family's history because as they move through the 2.5 years that they're at Sunnyside, a lot happens to my family. My great uncle, Dionisio, is the first man to die at Sunnyside. He's crushed by a falling tree. His wife is 7 months pregnant with their last child, and she gives birth to her child after he has died. She almost didn't make it to giving birth because she was in such despair. And these stories just hit you in waves when you're thinking about this could be my life. If I was back 150 odd years ago, this could be my life. But it's not, because they went through all of this suffering and just kept saying, I'm keeping the faith. I'm going to keep putting my foot one step forward and just keep going because it has to get better. And that's really the story of Tontitown, is they just kept saying it has to get better.
Tell me a little bit, how do these stories come to you? Are these, you mentioned a little bit, you have written records of these, and I'm sure you've researched more than anyone probably on the planet, but like, are these oral histories that come to you?
Yeah.
Tell me how these stories come to you today.
A lot of oral histories. My grandfather, he was one of the youngest of the 14 kids that my great-grandfather had. They also, my older cousins, so my dad's older cousins, they actually got the opportunity to sit down with Leo, with Mona Leo, that's what I call my great-grandfather. They sat down with him, and with a recorder on, they did an interview with him. They would record down stories of him talking about being 5 years old on the ship, and he was the only one not to get sick. And he was so proud of that, being this little boy and everyone around him is getting sick or watching his mother labor in the fields and calling her a small but mighty woman, and having these memories of his uncle working alongside his mother, and they were each other's best friends, and then literally watching him die right in front of him, watching his friends die right next door to him. These are stories that were passed down through oral histories, through written history, and it's all very hard to hear sometimes. I just recently, going through documents, one of my other older cousins had gone through and talked with my great aunt Eugenia, one of Leo's younger sisters, and reading these stories again and reaffirming the things that, like, you hear that you're thinking, oh, is this a legend? Is this a rumor? And then no, she's telling the story, and it's exactly how I've heard it told over and over again. This is true. It's fact. So there's I hear things and I take it with a grain of salt until I find another story or another person tells me, oh yeah, my grandma said the same thing. Okay, well, we can maybe put a little truth, a stamp on that and say, okay, that comes down to our oral histories.
Yeah, so this is not, to your point, stories that may have an air of legend to anyone. These are firsthand accounts.
Firsthand accounts,
that
yeah.
You've been able to reconnect back with, or family members have, that recorded these. Sounds like very diligently as well.
Yeah, and that's one of the Tontitown truisms, is that we find our history very important. And recording it is so important to us because memory only lasts as long as the person is alive. So what happens with those memories if they don't record them, if they're not documented, if someone sits down in front of you and says, tell me about your life. Tell me what happened when you were a child. Susan Young and the Tontitown Historical Museum, when they first got started, it was known as the Preservation Project. Their goal was to go through and talk to all of the people who were children of those original children settlers to ask, what was it like living during World War II and World War I? What was it like living in Tontitown in the 40s and the 50s? Tell us what growing up in Tontitown meant like. So it was really important from a very young age. I'm sitting on my grandpa's lap. He's telling me stories about his dad and telling me, oh, my nono, she died down in Sunnyside. And my great-grandfather watched his mom die in childbirth because there was no doctor for the plantation. The doctor that was there, he was too busy. He didn't have time to come over and be a midwife to a woman who had given birth 5 times before. She shouldn't have any problem. She had problems because she was having twins that got entangled. And so she bled to death in front of her family. These are stories that they are passed down, and as you get older and older, it hits you a little bit harder each time. Because, again, you're just thinking, wow, I appreciate my life so much more because of this.
Well, thank you. These are heavy stories.
Yeah,
even with your, obviously, no, I don't even know if that's fair to say, but like, I can, as I listen to you and watch your face, other people won't be able to see this. I can see the weight of those stories, right? Maybe let's pick back up that story of this idea of Sunnyside, which sounded like from the brochures and what they were signing up for was maybe what that American dream looked like at that point. But take us through what happened.
We're looking at the 1880s, early 1890s. Italian immigration to America is heavy at this point in time. And it's because of all those things that I said early on. In northern Italy, there's no room to grow. In southern Italy, the Cosa Nostra, the mafia, they're big. They are part of your day-to-day life. So a lot of the immigration to New York, they're escaping. They're trying to get out, or they're trying to escape the law because they are part of those gangs. So the Sunnyside Plantation Project came about with this idea that this Austin Corbin, he needed laborers. He couldn't get any. He was a New Yorker. No one wanted to work for him in the South. So they come up with this scheme to get Italians. You bring Italians over, it's got to be the right kind. They said Northern Italianers are the ones you want, not the Southerns, because that's where the mafia comes from. You don't want that entanglement. You need good Italians. So all these Italians are coming, and for the most part, these Northerners, they do farm. This is what they do in their day-to-day life. So being a field hand is not strange to them, but cotton is. So they're working on this plantation now that with a product that they wear it. They don't necessarily work with it, though. And, there are hardships along with the learning curve. They're also told, it'll be 2 to 3 years before you're acclimated. acclimation means you're good in the summer, you're good in the winter, you're good with all the diseases. So in northern Italy, there are no mosquitoes in northern Italy, in the Alps. Guess what? There's a lot of in southeast Arkansas. There's a lot of swamps and a lot of mosquitoes, and malaria runs rampant through the plantation. There's roughly over 1,000 Italians on the plantation. 98 families we've documented were on that ship, that first ship that arrives. And you got malaria, you got the fact that there is no drinking water. Dysentery is running rampant as well because they're not given all the tools to properly boil and strain and make sure they are healthy. They aren't given the proper care, in my opinion. They were just dumped and said, okay, go to work. And the more that they realize this is not right. We should not be living right next to this swamp that is just infested with mosquitoes. We shouldn't be living like this. We should have screens on our windows. We should have a artisanal well that we can collect rainwater. They knew that they deserved better treatment. And when they asked for it, they were ignored. We've got accounts of them writing the Arkansas bishops, writing New York, asking for aid, writing back home, asking for aid. The Pope at the time, he knew about this project. My great-great-grandfather, I love his tenacity because he really understood the value of writing. He wrote the Pope before they left and asked for a blessing on their journey. And the Pope, on All Souls Day, the day that they left Italy, the day they left their villages in Val del Vesubio, the Pope sent a blessing that was read to all of them leaving this village. And the Pope was aware of what was going on. Talk about pressure for Austin Corbin. You don't just have the Italian government keeping an eye. You got the Pope aware that there are Italians in southeast Arkansas and things are not going great. And then Austin Corbin dies in June 1896, right as that first harvest is really starting to bloom and things are happening. And it just all falls apart. Dionisio Pianalto, he dies in a logging accident in early spring. And then the ball just starts rolling after that death.
So the situation that your ancestors stepped into at Sunnyside Plantation, culturally, maybe give us some context about what that looks like in the late 1890s, because they're stepping into an environment that was really formed and shaped by a history of violence and exploitation. Give us some idea of what this looks like.
Yeah. So Arkansas, Sunnyside Plantation, for most people won't know about it because it doesn't exist today, but Sunnyside Plantation was the largest slave-owning plantation in all of Arkansas. All of Arkansas. It was the largest cotton plantation in all of Arkansas. It passed through many owners who, during the Civil War, the owner, he absconded to Texas with all of his enslaved people. And he came back. He had children that were mixed race, and his son actually ended up becoming a senator and a sheriff. His daughter was educated. The plantation holds this very kind of fraught history where it passes through all these owners, and eventually Austin Corbin has it, and he thinks, oh, we're going to create a community. He says, we're not going to do the sharecropping thing. We're going to create a community where eventually they're going to be landowners. That was not what was going on in the South on cotton plantations or any plantation. It was sharecropping. It was, hey, we're going to have you plant the crop. You'll get part of the profit. We'll get part of the profit. And then we'll just shake hands at the end of the harvest. It was not clean. It was not, no one benefited from sharecropping unless you were the landowner. And essentially these Italians, they've got this contract that says you'll get 12 and a half acres after 20 years. So it's yours. And it's that idea of I'm going to rent the land for 20 years and then it will be mine. Well, most of these men were signing these contracts in their 40s, 50s, 60s. Do they really think they're going to live for 20 years to see that actually fall into their ownership? No. They're doing it for their sons because there was a stipulation in the contract that if they die before their contract term is up, their sons could take over the remaining debt. So they were giving this opportunity. Again, in their minds, this contract is just everything. It's everything they wanted. And for other sharecroppers in the area, that was not something they had seen before. So it looked clean, but it wasn't. They're coming into an area where just the contract alone was illegal. They were contracting workers outside of the country. They were going to Italy with contracts to bring them over as laborers, but under the smokescreen that they are landowners. So they're tricking the U.S. government, the Italian government, and saying it's all clean. It's not clean. And they're bringing these Italians. The first group comes through New Orleans in 1892, I believe it was, about 3 years before. The largest lynching of Italians happened in New Orleans. And they're coming into this area that is already anti-Italian. New Orleans had a huge Italian population in the late 1880s, 1890s. And a police officer gets shot in the middle of the night. His dying breath, he says the Dagos did it. And Dagos is a racial slur for Italians. And they round up 60 men for one murder. He had no proof that it was a Dago. They had no proof. They tried over a dozen. They're all acquitted and returned back to the jail. And in the middle of the night, instead of being told you can go home, you're free, you're innocent, they go back to jail where a mob masses pulls 11 innocent men. Some of them hadn't even gone to trial yet, and lynched them in the city center. Imagine pulling up on a boat 3 years after that happened with your children and thinking, are we going to get through this city alive? Are we going to be allowed to get to the plantation where we own land? The Italian government had to have assurances before they got into New Orleans that they were not going to be lynched.
Help us frame this, because I think probably for most people who aren't familiar with this history, it's definitely not a part of the history books that I heard.
No.
This kind of racial environment is something that we talk about. And from an American perspective, we understand that in the terms of African-American violence and racial segregation. And
there was a huge prejudice against the Italians because they were the new other, the new immigration populace that's coming in and taking jobs and taking land and taking up space. That was the thing up in New York, was they're taking up space. We don't want them in our space. But they didn't want to help them get out of New York. Father Pietro Bandini, at this point in time, 1892, he is in New York trying to get someone to back his plan to literally take Italians from New York City, put them on a train, and send them to Wyoming. Wyoming's wanting more immigrants, wanting more people because they want to become a state at that point in time. They need more people to become a state. Father Bandini has this idea, let's get them out. Let's get them out of the places where they're not wanted. And the government, we don't want to give them handouts. If we give them a handout and they go cause trouble out there, then that's just another problem we have to deal with. The Italians were just seen as a problem upon a problem. They keep coming in. We can't stop them. By the 1910, there are immigration laws specifically written to keep Italians out of America. Those laws are still in place, but they are not targeting Italians anymore. They are targeting the new other. And it's this revolving door of who's the new group that's coming in mass. It's not just, oh, there's a few people coming from Italy and we're worried. There are thousands of people coming every day from Italy and we're worried. Well, why are you worried? It's the stigma. Up in New York, you get a lot of Southern Italians, Central Italians, Sicilians. Northern and Southern Italians are different. Ancestry.com actually stipulates that there is a difference in DNA between Northern Italians and Southern Italians. So when I did a DNA test, it says you are X amount Northern Italian. It doesn't say just Italian. It specifies the difference. We're all loud. We use our hands as I'm doing. We're always fighting between each other. That's Italy. Italy is a country that was always fighting, always bickering. There was always something to fight about. And so, you have these people, they don't speak the language. They're not Protestants. They're not Baptists. They're not Methodists. They're Catholic. Up in New York, you get a lot of Sicilians, a lot of Southern Italians that are very dark. They don't look like us. They got slick back hair. They're not American. And that was really what it was. They weren't American. And so how do we trust them? How do we communicate with these people when we don't understand where they're coming from, what they're doing here, and just what they're about? And so that's where the Tontitown story kind of evolves.
I mean, Emily, there's a lot there. And this could turn into 15 episodes, I feel like. Because I wasn't sure as you were describing that situation, if you're talking about the reality of modern day, and you're not specifically, but I think this perspective or this situation that these Italian immigrants find themselves in has incredible parallels to the story of immigration to this country in many ways. And I think, sitting with you, the goal is to try to understand that, a perspective that maybe we've not seen before.
Yeah.
And maybe before we go into modern day implications, although that's hard to do, as I'm
it's so easy to just go straight into it.
Yeah, well, I want to jump to all of that, but maybe place us in the story a little bit, because they step into this space at Sunnyside Plantation to find themselves in a place that they didn't expect, amongst a very hostile environment, at least. But ultimately, they have the ability to leave that place, right?
Yes.
And so I'm happy to talk more about the reality of Sunnyside, but I'm also really curious of what is it that they finally say enough is enough and something has to change?
So really, Austin Corbin dying in 1896 in that summertime, his heirs, they were already contracting a second group. Another group was being handed contracts saying, come to Southeast Arkansas, come to the plantation. They put a pause on that. His heirs were like, until the will is set, we really can't bring any more people. We can't be responsible for more people. And then they quickly get everything in order and say, okay, if we're going to make money off of this project, his son-in-law was one of the people that takes over. They're like, we need more people to make more money. So they ended up bringing another shipload over. And by this point, Father Bandini is down with the Italians. He was working with Austin Corbin, trying so hard to get all the things that were needed, trying to get screens on the windows, trying to get mosquito nets for the beds, trying to get wells and all these things that they were asking for done. The new owners don't care. The new owners are once again saying, why should we put more money into something that we haven't seen a profit from? So until we see a profit, we're not doing anything. Second group comes in, and it's 1897 by the time that they're in Sunnyside, and everything has just basically fallen apart by this point. The Italians start actually sending different groups of people. So the way Sunnyside was set up, it was regional. In Italy, we all speak different Italian from region to region. If you're from Veneto, you're not speaking the same Italian as if you're from Orvieto, from Rome. Very different dialects. And so they almost couldn't communicate with each other. And so that was an issue on the plantation.
Maybe by intention.
Yeah. And so each group, they did have various different regions represented, especially from that second group. The second group was actually from more central Italy. They were also not farmers. They were shopkeepers. They were shoemakers. They were carpenters and stonemasons. They did not farm. So they were shocked when they were on the plantation. They had been told, oh yeah, eventually this will be a community. There will be shops. There will be industries other than farming for you to do. That was all taken away with the new owners. They said, nope, it's farming only. Then they started to rip up the contracts and say, you know what, if you're going to keep complaining, we're just going to make a whole new deal. And the new deal was even worse than the original deal. They were no longer going to be paid in U.S. currency. They were going to be paid in Sunnyside company money, meaning that money was not good outside of the plantation. You are locked to the land. You are stuck where you are at. And so you have these delegations from all these different groups going out into the South Some of them went to Alabama, Louisiana, Texas, and just searching for other opportunities. And they go back. The owners are saying, okay, we've got a new contract. If you will sign it, stay. We'll keep going with the way that we've stipulated, or you can leave. We're not helping you. That was one thing that an investigation had started in early 1897. And the investigation said, this place is uninhabitable for human life, any human life. These people need to be given reparations. They need to be paid what they were due. And all of the money that they invested into this land needs to be repaid. And they need to be helped back to their homeland. The new owners say, okay, you can leave without having to repay your debts. That was as good as they were going to get. You can leave with your life, and whatever little money you scrounged away and saved, go and have a good life.
This is maybe just for my own knowledge. Were they in Sunnyside with other immigrant groups as well too,
Yes.
or formerly enslaved people as well?
Yes.
What did that situation look like?
Some of the stories, I don't have a lot of stories of those specific interactions, but from what I've read, there were some formerly enslaved African Americans who were living on the plantation, and it seemed like they were taking the Italians under their wing and teaching them about the crop that they were having to work with, because again, they don't know what cotton is as far as the plant goes. They know what the fabric is, what the fiber is. But we do know that there were some interactions. I can't tell you what other immigrant groups were down there because predominantly it was Kentucky origin for the white people that had eventually moved to Arkansas to buy plantations, had descendants. So they're white, more than likely Irish, German descent, but then African Americans. So there were still there, and there is still a big population down in Southeast Arkansas. As far as those interactions and those stories, we don't have a lot.
There's still a big population of Italian.
African American and Italians down there as well, because after the split happens, after all the groups that want to leave, only 31 families signed that new contract out of 178. And 178 is the rough number because from what my great-grandfather has told all the family, he watched whole families die. He said Sunnyside is the place where Italians went to die. That is what he thought as a 6-year-old. They brought us here just to die. They didn't care about what happened to the families and the fact that you could have a mother, father, and 6 children all die in a week and be buried all in the same grave. In the cemetery that's down there, that his uncle, his own mother, and his twin young siblings that did not survive birth, that cemetery was almost developed. All of the headstones are gone because in the 30s, someone said, oh, this land, we could till this land if the stones weren't there, and nobody knew that this was a cemetery. This is almost a generation after these deaths happened, and they're still kind of kicking us while we're down. Why take headstones out of a cemetery that was marking this point of history on this plantation, that this plantation happened and that these deaths happened because they did not want to help them. They didn't want to give them drinking water. They didn't want to give them ways to keep the mosquitoes from just absolutely wreaking havoc on their homes. Southeast Arkansas is not a pleasant place to be in July. Now imagine being down there with no screens on your doors or windows and no AC. And so the only thing you can do to keep the air flowing in your house is opening all the windows, inviting all of those bugs in. There's no safe place to go. You are going to get sick.
Does that cemetery still exist?
It does. I actually had the opportunity last summer to go visit it for the first time.
Has it been cared for or reestablished? Or
no, and that's something that there's a goal within a group of Tontitown descendants who have ancestors buried up there that we would like to get up there, do some, I'm not sure what the terminology is, but to do some land graphing. And actually try to find where each person is buried or where multiple people are buried and just try to start gathering those names because we know they're there. The flood that happened did not wash away those graves. There's a cross that memorializes, and then there's a place marker that actually talks about the story, but that's about it.
given all of these stories, like, how would you describe the power system that existed at that time?
Well, especially if think of the Italian. You're coming into this country, you don't speak the language, you don't look or dress the way that everyone else is dressing. You don't even have necessarily the same currency. So you're coming in and you're relying on others to help you. And that's all that they were doing, is they were relying on Austin Corbin and the managers of the plantation to help them, to understand what they were getting into, explaining how to farm cotton, how to communicate with their neighbors, with the other Americans that are outside of Sunnyside Plantation. And they're really relying on others. And so that's why it's so easy for them to be taken advantage of. Italian immigrants, all immigrants, face exploitation at a higher rate than any other person. Children, of course, but in a way, an immigrant and a child are hand in hand. They don't necessarily understand what's going on around them to be fully informed by experience. An immigrant might see something and say, that's not right, but how do they communicate it? If they're using their hands, they're just seen as, oh, they're wacky. We don't know what they're trying to say, but they're funny to try to listen to. And they're mocked in a way. They aren't seen as the same level of citizenry. Immigrants, they're the lowest of the low. In a way, on the plantation, they were seen as lesser than the formerly enslaved African Americans. They were, in a term, white trash. They weren't even white. They didn't see them as white. They were immigrant trash. They were just there to do what they needed to do. And if they died, that's okay. We can get another boatload. And that's what they did. They got another boatload. And after the Italians separated and the company was left with 31 families, they waited a couple years and then they started bringing more Italians over. More Italians over every year for over a decade are brought over and treated the exact same way, if not worse. There were immigrants who tried to leave the plantation because they were trying to earn more money to pay their debt off quicker so they could own the land or leave. These men went to the manager, got permission to leave when it was off season to go work in a mine. They're on the train headed to this mine that's just a couple hours away. They're pulled forcibly from this train by the sheriff and arrested for leaving when they owe a debt. And they are returned to the plantation. And then the next day in the middle of the night, the owners come to their house and say, you no longer have property here. You no longer have a contract. Get off of the land. And they're kicked out in the middle of the night in February. The treatment it's just horrendous. And this happened after my ancestors left. I just can't even describe what else happened down there because from the point that my family leaves in 1898, we hear good things about their life because they left. Yeah.
Good Lord. I think you're giving me a context that I didn't know existed, if I'm honest. I've tried to do my homework, of which I've failed miserably. I think I'm starting to
so
see.
Much.
Well, but I think what you're revealing is the story of Italian immigrants, but what you're revealing, even broader cultural narrative and framework affected so many people that it's obviously we see how this also comes into modern day as well too. So I think the framework that you're providing is just much, much larger than what's happening to a group of Italian immigrants. That is significant. Yeah. I'm not saying it's not, but when you talk about the plight of immigration and you talk about the plight of labor exploitation, these are some massive frameworks that have developed over centuries that now find themselves taking their toll, taking their measure on these Italian immigrants that came to your ancestors.
Yeah.
Walk me through, we'll get to modern day, but walk me through what happens, if you will, once they come here to Northwest Arkansas on this journey.
Yeah. So Father Bandini, he had gotten sick several times on the plantation as well. And so at one point in time, he was ordered to leave to get better air, to convalesce. So he came up to Northwest Arkansas to rest and recover from his illness. And we believe he was up in Rogers. So he was aware of Northwest Arkansas when he goes back down to the Italians and they're just all up in arms, like, we're leaving, we're done with this. And he's okay. I know of a place. It's got clean air. All of the towns have spring in it. Siloam Springs, Eureka Springs, Springdale. There's clean water. There's natural springs all around this area. Let's go there. So he brings Felix Artemani, Pietro Pianalto, Domenico Pianalto, and my great-grandfather, Leo. He was 8 years old at the time. They actually come up to Northwest Arkansas. Bandini's, okay, what do you think? And they all are like, this is it.
This is like a scouting expedition.
This was a scouting expedition. They were the delegates from their group, from the Veneto group, that were like, okay, we're going to go find our new home. So they get up here. And the story, this is one of those lovely legends. Felix Artemani, as they're cresting the Boston Mountains, I always tell people that the Bobby Hopper Tunnel didn't exist back then. They had to go over the mountains to get up here. But the story goes that as they're cresting over the Boston Mountains, Felix Artemani says, we are home. When you look at pictures of del Pasubio, where my family's from, it's right on the Alps. There are mountains, there are rolling hills, there are trees. It is just gorgeous. What do you have up in Northwest Arkansas? You've got rolling hills, you've got small mountains. People always say those aren't mountains, but they're mountains for Arkansas. It reminded them of a little Italy. So they get up here and this is home. They get up here and there was a family called the Smith family. They owned most of the land, like what we're sitting on today. The numbers go all over the place from 200 to 600 acres, but it was a large amount of acreage. The family had served in the Civil War, so they were given land and they couldn't farm it. They couldn't make a profit. So they were like, you want this land? Sure, you can have it for $8 an acre. And we don't know if it was personal prejudice or pressures from neighboring towns, but when they found out who was buying the land, Father Bandini he speaks English, Italian, Latin. He spoke several native languages as well. He was a missionary. So he comes in, he's the dealer. He's making all the contracts, signing all the deeds and everything. But when they find out that it's actually Italian immigrants, poor Italian immigrants coming and moving, they raised the price of $15 an acre. And Father Bandini couldn't afford that. So he actually had to go out and get loans. And luckily, Father Bandini, I always love to say, he was the politician. He would shake hands and kiss babies, and he made friends with everybody. It was really good. He did. A man named J.H. Meagle from Magnolia, Arkansas, was a Catholic, heard about the Italian immigrants, like what was happening down in Sunnyside. And I say he heard. Sunnyside plantation was published about nationwide. I have found references in Chicago, New York, Connecticut, the Carolinas. I have seen references in Oklahoma just about this plantation and what was going on, and the fact that there were investigations at this time. And J.H. Meagle hears about this. They're Catholic, they're poor, they're just trying to get their start that they didn't have on the plantation. He foots the bill. He pays $4,800 for the initial purchase of Tontitown land, with the stipulation that the Italians would repay the debt within the first good harvest. And it was really good. He said first, because it took 2 years to get a good harvest. The Italians, they come very slowly. It depended on their contract. I've got newspaper records that there were Italians as early as February in Northwest Arkansas, and then more references of 10 more families have arrived as late as May. They were coming in small groups. I know personally that my family came via train. My great-grandfather, he was fairly wealthy back in Italy. He was able to amass money from teaching, so he had some money set back. And luckily, he did make a little profit off of that first harvest. So they were able to buy train tickets and get up to Northwest Arkansas. And they did try to live in Springdale just for a little bit while they were waiting on everyone else to get up here and Father Bandini to settle purchasing all of the land and the houses. And my great-grandfather talked about, they tried to go to the school in Springdale and they were almost stoned. Local kids and adults would throw rocks at them and just hurl the worst racial slurs.
These are firsthand accounts, too.
Yes. And this is an 8-year-old boy walking to school with his 6-year-old sister, 5-year-old sister. His little brother wouldn't have been going to school yet. He would have been 3. But these are little kids, and adults are doing this. And very quickly they said, yeah, we tried to go for 2 days and we stopped because we knew if we kept trying, we would end up getting hurt or worse. So they stayed home until Father Bandini and everyone else got up here. And then when enough of the families are up here, they're living just like back in Italy, 2 to 3 families per house. And they're not relatives anymore. You've got the Morsanis and the Papili and the Bastinelli families all living in the same barn together. That's, how so many of these children of the first settlement, they end up all marrying each other because they grew up in this very concentrated point in history of Tontitown where they were old enough to have known what happened down at Sunnyside, but they got to grow up with Tontitown. So they got to be here when it was settled, got to see Ambassador de Planches arrive in 1905 and say, wow, what a great town you guys have made. And see Father Bandini become mayor and see him die and then go all the way through World War I, World War II. And they are, I call them, they're the Tontitown generation. Zelinda Bastinelli, one of the owners of the house that we're in, she was 16 when she arrived in America. And she died in 1985 at 102.
Wow.
She got to see Tontitown literally from dirt road 412 that barely had 2 lanes to a 5-lane highway that has semi-trucks driving right in front of her house. These people got to see it all. And so their stories are so important, and why it was so important for the museum to really gather all these stories up, because they saw it all. They experienced the racial slurs, the prejudice firsthand. My great-grandfather had to walk into the schoolhouse that was almost burned down over the weekend and sit and take a grammar class because he was trying to learn English. That way he could go get a job. Miss Bernadette Brady was the first school teacher. She was from Arkansas. She was hired by Father Bandini to go to Sunnyside Plantation. She started teaching the kids at Sunnyside, and she loved Father Bandini so much, she came with him to Tontitown and continued teaching the children. She would teach the kids during the day and the adults at night because the adults wanted to learn English so badly. They all wanted to become American because they just wanted to fit in. Father Bandini really instilled the need to learn English, because if you do not know English, you will be taken advantage of. If you don't know the language, you cannot protect yourself and what is yours. They learned that very quickly. Father Bandini he was out of town. I think he was in Eureka Springs. I haven't found the record yet, but the tax people come through, and back then they would knock on your door and do your taxes right at your door, and you would then have to pay them. The tax guy came to Tontitown, and no one in Tontitown paid their taxes because no one was in town who could read English and translate it to them saying their taxes are due. They had the money for taxes. They just didn't know it was time to pay them. Father Bandini gets back and finds out they've all been fined. And he goes to the Washington County judge and says, they have the money. Could you just be lenient? They did not have a translator. We just need some grace in this learning period for them. The judge said no. He fined them, and the Italians learned very quickly how important it was to know English, but also how important it was to have applied for citizenship. Back in those days, early 1900s, if you had declared your intent to become a citizen, it was about a 4-year process to be fully a citizen. But if you had signed a declaration of intent, you could vote. Most of them had signed that declaration of intent within the first 2 years of settlement. You have to be on the land for 2 years. Then you can sign your declaration of intent. So by 1900, you've got all of the men signing their declaration of intent and all of the 18-year-olds signing their declaration of intent. Guess what judge gets voted out the next election? They learn the power of the vote, the power of English, the power of being part of America and being in it, and how important it was. And that was Father Bandini's doing. And people always say, we've got people up in New York. I've got friends from New Jersey that are Italian, and they look at us like, you guys have lost so much of your culture. That's exactly what Father Bandini wanted, and what my great-great-grandfather wanted, what my great-grandfather wanted. They wanted to be American because that's why they came here. They came here to be American and to get the American benefits. We still hold our Italian heritage close in our hearts. I still consider myself Italian American, even though I'm Polish and Cherokee and English. Like, I'm still Italian American because of the history that I hold so dear to my heart. But being American and being part of the society that we're living in was so important to them. And World War I was that turning point where by that point they already felt themselves American, but they weren't seen American by their neighbors. Springdale didn't want the Italians in their school district, so they said, keep them in Tontitown. The St. Joseph's School was built in the 30s, but in the early 1900s, St. Mary's Academy opened, and it was a boarding school and a day school. And it was led by nuns. It was more religious, but when the fire happened in 1927, burned that building down, they rebuilt the stone church that's currently sitting there. And it was a public school. It was publicly funded by the state and taught by nuns. And the reason for that was, again, they didn't want the Italians in Springdale. They wanted them to stay in Tontitown. They wanted that separation of the cultures. And it just, then in the 80s, that kind of changes. And they didn't like the fact that there was a state-funded school that was run by Catholics. So changing times happen through Tontitown.
I'd love your perspective too, because I think today I've been in Northwest Arkansas for 35 to 40 years, I feel like. And there's this awareness of Tontitown that I've known of, and Italian immigrants. But I think in many ways that identity is probably, it feels like it's shifted in some ways. And obviously the value and what you're trying to hold on to here at the museum is to hold on to that identity. But culturally, where do the people, these Italian descendants such as yourself, where do you sit within this space today culturally, if that makes sense?
Again, I still consider myself Italian American, and there are still traditions that we hold dear to our heart. The Grape Festival is the longest running fruit festival in Arkansas. And we still do a grape stomp, and that harkens back again to the old country, to Italy. And specifically the museum, we hold a polenta smear every year. And most people, they hear polenta smear and they say, what is that? That sounds medical, that sounds gross. And it harkens back to northern Italy and the fact that they grew corn. And we hold these traditions just so dear because if we don't, then they fall away. And why they're important falls away as well. In Tontitown, the first winter, polenta with rabbit was all they could eat. So that's why we still hold the polenta smear, not just for northern Italy, but because that first winter, the only meat they could catch was rabbit. And they said if it hadn't been for the rabbits, we would have died. And so we hearken back to that first winter, 1898, of them suffering and just trying to feed themselves because, again, if you couldn't grow it, you couldn't eat. And they were poor when they got up here, so they weren't going to Springdale and buying groceries upon groceries. That was not a thing back then. And not only just holding those Italian roots close to our hearts, it's holding those first couple years of Tontitown very dear in our hearts, because through the struggle is where we reap the benefits. That first summer, 1898, they hold a picnic. And it was in June. June 29th is when the Tontitown picnic was. It was to celebrate Father Bandini and the fact that he saved them. That is what many of them talked about, was that Father Bandini was like the savior. He was the Moses that led them out of the swampland. And he heard them. He heard what was going on, and he wanted to help. And so they host this picnic, not only for Father Bandini, but to just thank God for their lives and the fact that they have a chance to live a new life and to actually do what they came to America to do, which was farm, raise their families, and embrace this new culture that they had moved into. And so the picnic happens, and they all bring their family dishes. Most of them bring polenta, stews, The Morsani, Virginia Morsani, brings her spaghetti, and very quickly, it happens every year. Every June, it happens. And then by 1913, we have grapes. It's moved to August, and we have the Grape Festival. When you read stories of my grandfather's generation, they talk about the Grape Festival. It was so much fun as a kid, and it's just so much work. But you hear them talk about their parents and how important it was for their parents. So my great-grandfather's generation. It was important to them because this was their connection to Northwest Arkansas. This is how Northwest Arkansas came to embrace Tontitown. If it wasn't for the festival, their neighbors in Johnson and Fayetteville, Springdale, Eureka Springs, Salem Springs would have never come into the city center and sat down at a meal with them under the trees, because that's what they were doing. They were having Virginia Morsani by 1904. She's making her spaghetti at her home. She's mixing it, putting it on a pan, and walking from her home to the schoolhouse, the Smith Schoolhouse in city center, about a mile and a half with the pasta on her head to feed guests. They eat under the trees. They eat picnic style. And it was inviting their neighbors in for this simple meal, very simple meal. To have races. They would do like sack races, ladies races. They had a fat man's race once and the same guy won 2 years in a row. They would have like mule races, slow mule races. They had fun. And they just showed their American neighbors, this is how we have fun. And the neighbors were like, well, that's also how we have fun. We have a connection now. And it just builds year after year with this festival. And again, in the newspapers, they continuously say, especially in those early years, all are invited. They're not excluding anyone for religion, race, gender. They said everyone is allowed to come here and enjoy this afternoon with us. And it was so important. And it's still true today. In Northwest Arkansas, the Grape Festival is one of the highest attended festivals in our region, and everyone is welcome. 126 years, everyone is welcome.
Well, I love that. It speaks to, a sense of belonging and a sense of place and building a community. Mm-hmm. Coming here, given the history that your ancestors had of maybe not being welcome, to a place where your response is to say all are welcome. Mm-hmm. It's a pretty tremendous transformation.
Yeah, big turnabout.
Yeah.
Where they were excluded from everything, they in turn said, no one is excluded.
I feel like we have some things to learn from these stories for our modern day culture and our attitude about what it means to be welcome in a place. I'm curious, given the history of Tontitown and given the history of your ancestors and immigration, maybe if you want to, invite you to speak into the modern day situation around what immigration looks like. We're obviously here in Springdale. There's a large immigrant population. And given our national dialogue, if you want to call it that, I'm curious, what do you see happening from your perspective in this world that maybe your history and your background, your perspective could maybe give us some insight into?
Yeah, I went to Springdale. I was in Springdale Public Schools, so I was around a lot of first generation immigrants. They came with their parents, grandparents. They were born here or they weren't born here. And so now that I'm working here, we have a group of students that come from one of the local middle schools, and they come in, new group every year, and they always want to get a tour and learn about the history. And so when I tell the story, I spend it talking more about my great-grandfather and his experience as a child. He came over as an immigrant. He did not know English, so he had to learn English. And then very quickly, because the children, they're sponges, they learn the English so quickly. They're translating for their parents. And that was one thing that this group of students, they came in, and I'm telling the story and talking about how the kids would go with their parents to Springdale to buy groceries. And they'd be trying to translate. They need a tub to make whiskey, to make wine. But they needed certain things, and they were trying to translate for their parents. And the girls and boys are just looking at me like, I do that for my parents. I thought this was just something that we did because we speak Spanish. And it just dawns on them, the story of immigration, it's a revolving door. Like I said earlier, it's a new group every so many decades. There's a new group, a new language that is the barrier. And so those connections that we're making with our story of immigration and the modern immigration is so important because we get through the hardship, we get through the prejudice. It takes a generation to get through prejudice in Tontitown. You know, as far as trying to burn down buildings and trying to arrest them for petty crime. My father still had racial slurs slung at him when he went to St. Joseph's School until 8th grade, and in 9th grade, he's walking into Southwest Junior High and being called a WAP. This is the 60s. And you just have to, he's third generation, so as an immigrant, you're always going to be faced with those things, whether it's name calling, whether it's inaccurately stating, oh, you must be this ethnicity. And it's handling it with grace that is super important. And the way that the Italians handled most of their problems was they just handled it with grace. And that's hard to do nowadays because we're in a society where it's like, you should know better, they should know better than to say these things or do these things. And I feel bad for the immigrants now because it's just non-ending. Social media did not exist when the immigrants, my ancestors, were coming over. The newspaper existed. Springdale News published in 1895 that Italians, that Dagos were coming to Arkansas. This was 3 years before they come to Northwest Arkansas. But they felt the need to publicize that there are Italians in Arkansas and basically be warned criminals are moving in. Had social media been a thing back then, I can only imagine what would have happened, and they probably would have left. They probably would have not stayed. And having grace to accept people for who they are and not the ethnicity, the race, the religion that they are personally is so important. Italians were given this moniker, they're all thugs, they're all gangsters, they're all mobsters. They were just lumped into this whole class of people. And then you get Tontitown. CBS News in 1971 did a documentary, and they came to Tontitown, Arkansas, population 474. They filmed at a grape festival. They talked about the assimilation of these Italians. They were not Italians, they're Italian Americans. They look like everyone else in Northwest Arkansas. They speak the same language. They don't have an accent anymore. You couldn't tell that they're Italian or German. They just were from Tontitown. They build it as, we're going to be talking about Italian American life. Comes out, the title is The Mafia. Tontitown was used in that documentary to show what Italians should have done when they came to America. They're showing this is the year The Godfather comes out. They're showing Columbo being shot. They're showing these gangsters in New York and New Jersey wreaking havoc all over the streets. And then clip to Northwest Arkansas. And watching that documentary, it made me really understand how important it was for Tontitown to do what they did in the early years. Because if they hadn't done, that stigma would have just stayed on them for generation after generation. And I don't want to say everyone needs to become American and speak the language. I wish my ancestors had continued to teach us Italian. My dad doesn't speak Italian. His dad didn't know. He knew a little Italian just from being yelled at by his father and mother. But they lost the language, which in a way they lost part of that culture because, again, our village in northern Italy speaks a very specific dialect. So when we go back, we can't even communicate with them. I have cousins still in Italy that are still living in the family home that I can't communicate with because we lost our language. We lost part of our culture in that. So it's a delicate balancing act of becoming American and still holding your culture and holding those roots that you come from, whether you're a third, fourth generation. It's still important to know where you came from because that informs who you are as an American. You know, my story with Italian immigrant background, I do hold a special place in my heart for immigrants coming nowadays because I think, man, you could have been my great-grandfather. You could have been this little boy on a boat just so excited for the future because you're going to America. You're going to the place where everything is sunshine and daisies. And you get here and you're not treated how you thought. Father Bandini, he had a scathing rebuke for the vandals who tried to burn down the school. And he actually said, perhaps if I had taken my people among savages, Native Americans, they would have been treated better. It just speaks to the culture that Americans always hate others. Generation after generation, the Irish, the Germans, Japanese, Chinese, every group has gone through it. And right now, it's our citizens from Mexico, from South America, they're dealing with it. And again, social media has so much influence over the attitude. If social media wasn't as big as it is now and in everyone's pocket, I think the acceptance would have been a lot quicker coming about. We need them. We need immigrant laborers. We need them. There's no longer grape vineyards in Arkansas or in Tontitown. There's no longer chicken farming in Tontitown. Tontitown was the first contract with George's and Tyson's when they started up. Those industries don't exist because there are not people in this town that want to do them. So we've lost part of our culture in farming. Maybe if we'd had more workers that were willing to do that work to keep that part of our culture alive, it would still be here. They're needed. And it's part of the American story. Immigration, I'm sorry, I have links all the way back to the Mayflower on my mom's side. We are immigrants unless you were born from a native tribe. You're an immigrant. Everyone has an immigrant story. They didn't want the people on the Mayflower here. There has been anti-immigration since the Mayflower. It's just a story. It just revolves.
You have a very prophetic voice in this space. I'm sorry for what they do to prophets. You have the authority to say what you are saying because of the reality of what your ancestors have been through and the reality of what's happening in our world today. Is it easy? It's probably not easy, but can you articulate the disconnect that we have today that maybe has not just been today, but maybe it's been here from the beginning?
It really has been here from the beginning. Watching commercials on like CBS, they always do these documentaries, and one of them's about the immigration crisis. And I hear this one guy say, "We don't want them here." And this might be me just conjecture. I'm looking at him. He's in New York, and I'm thinking, you're probably an Italian descendant. So how are you having this hatred in your heart for an immigrant when your parents or grandparents were that person coming off of Ellis Island and just trying to find their way in the world and trying to find sanctuary from a lot of the immigrants that were coming in those early days? They were trying to get away from the mob. They were trying to get away from the bad things happening in their homeland. They were seeking refuge in America. So how do you have that attitude that these people are unwanted and that these people don't belong here and that we shouldn't do anything for them when someone in your family's history decided to lend a hand and welcome them into their space, into the space of just the town, and say, you're good here. You have a spot here. Yes, it could have been in Little Italy, but that was still a space for them in America that was created. So they had a place to go and communicate and have a family whether it was their blood family or just the family that you create through relationships. You have to have an open mind. And again, think about your own family. Everyone has an immigrant story in America. Everyone. African Americans have an immigrant story that is very different than the immigrant story of the Irish. But then you have Italians like my ancestors whose immigrant story, in a way, shakily correlates to some African American immigrant stories. My great-grandfather came to America on a ship that was chartered just for the Italian immigrants coming to the plantation. How do you correlate that with an immigrant who bought a ticket by himself, came to America by himself with no family and just made a go of it? I've talked to immigrants who they came over as teenagers by themselves or with their parent, and their parent died and they're just left on their own. Having the space in your own heart and mind to just put yourself in their shoes is so important. And it doesn't have to be the modern immigrant. Go back and think about your great-grandfather. Put yourself in that space and think, how much courage does it take to leave your home, leave the place that you know the language, you know the laws, you know the people, the religion, you know the dirt that you are standing on, and to just say, I'm starting over in a whole new country with a new language, new laws that you do not understand, and all these people that, might speak 50 different languages around you. You're in a place that is totally foreign. How much courage does that take? Do you have that courage to leave your home in America and go to Africa and even go back to Italy? Again, a place that you probably you're going to hear some English, but I've got family that have gone back and said it took an hour to find someone who spoke English. Courage. People aren't as courageous as their ancestors were. And it's that courage that we need to think about in our own stories. And just look at that person, that immigrant that came to Arkansas and is working at the Tyson's, chicken plant, who's taking a job that you don't want to do. How much courage does that take? They could have been a teacher back in their village. They could have been a police officer that was being hunted by gangs. And they're here working a menial job, maybe 12 hours a day, and they're just trying to get by. How much courage do you have?
I don't think there's anything else to say. I have two questions for you that I'll finish with. I asked this question to all of our guests because I feel like some ways that your articulation to the answer of these questions helps us with our own reckoning, our own understanding of ourselves. And the first question is this: what do you fear for this place?
Honestly, I fear a disconnect with the history. Tontitown is the fastest growing town in all of Arkansas. They came out with that last year from the census report. And we do have a lot of new faces. They're not Italian immigrants of those descendants. They come in here and they have their own stories. And it's so important for you to know the place that you're inhabiting and to know the story. So it's so important for people to learn the local history, whether you're in Tontitown or Springdale, Bentonville, Rogers. Go to your community museum. Go ask some questions. Go figure out how the town got named, because that will tell you so much about the history and why this place is important. Just really asking those questions. And that's my biggest fear, is when people stop asking questions, they stop learning. You need to keep learning. Learn about your space, learn about yourself. I hope, and what I've heard from people is they come in and we talk, I tell the story, they ask questions, and some of them just want to know about where the vineyards are. Some of them want to know why the church got taken down. They want to know different things, but then they leave and they think, man, you know so much about your history. I need to know more about mine. And that's my hope, is that when people come here, they have their own leap into history. They want to journey back and see their own immigrant story and see where their families fit into this history, that everyone's history is so unique. And it's just so important to know where you came from.
You already are starting to move to my second question. But my second question is around this idea of community wholeness and trying to understand what that looks like, maybe individually, maybe as a community. But when I use that word wholeness, what does wholeness look like for you in this space?
For me, it really means embracing everything, not just the nitpick history. That's one of my big goals now that I'm in charge of the museum, is getting Tontitown past the 1960s. We have so much history that is from the early days. We have founding family photos. We have the original city ordinances written in Father Bandini's hand. We have so many things from those early years. But we need to start embracing the more modern history with the incoming of non-Italians. Father Bandini actually advertised Tontitown as a refuge for Italians and for Catholics. So early on, there were a lot of non-Italians that came in. They loved the town just because it was like, got a Catholic priest who's also in charge of the city, and we're all just like living in harmony. Nowadays, most of the town is not Catholic. The Catholic Church is still there, still at city center. We have different ethnicities, different religions, different ideas, different people. And I think making sure that we represent all of the growth and all the different ways that it's happened is so important, because, again, if we don't embrace it, if we don't tell it, we lose it. We've got to keep the history alive, no matter whether it's good or bad. I'm a true historian, and that if it's bad, I'm going to write it down. I'm going to figure out how to put that into the story, because it's just as important as the good. We can't have day without night, and the good and bad are always hand in hand.
Given this idea of wholeness, what represents Tontitown to you today?
Oh, gosh. I think one of the biggest representations that I see is our Italian immigrant statue, and the fact that we have American and Italian flags on all of the buildings. When you go into City Hall, they still have an Italian flag standing. There's no one directly from Italy living in this town anymore. But it's embracing that part of the history and knowing how important it is and teaching it. The museum's here to teach this history and to include the newcomers. We've had new people come into the museum and they said, I had no idea about this and I want to learn more. And embracing it, coming to the Grape Festival, coming and enjoying a lunch at Mama Z's, dinner at Venetian Inn, going and getting a pizza at Guido's. It's embracing these local traditions and then giving back in your own way. We have a farmer's market that local people in Tontitown, again, not Italian descendants at all, but they come and bring their own vegetables and baked goods. And it just harkens back to what the Italians were doing at the beginning. They were baking bread communally. They were bringing vegetables and trading and just still embracing those traditions that we had in those early days, just in a modern view. And again, your neighbor is your neighbor and your neighbor has a story. And that's really what makes the community, is all those stories coming together and forming this collective history that is Tontitown.
Well, Emily, thank you for your role in this story. Thank you for sharing it. Thank you for giving us a perspective that I think is absent in our world today. And yeah, I just want to say thank you for being here, for being a part of this conversation, and for your wisdom and for your work. People can come visit the Tontitown Historical Museum.
Yes, they can visit Wednesday through Saturday. We're open different times during the day, but just check us out on Facebook and we've got all of the information there. More stories are posted on social media that aren't in the museum. So we try to hit all the angles in many different ways.
Emily, thank you again for being a part of this conversation. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, a special thank you to Emily. The story that she shared with us today is more than a chapter in Northwest Arkansas's history. It's a window into how communities are built, not just from stone and soil, but from memory and sacrifice and the refusal to disappear. We heard how these Italian immigrants left the hills of northern Italy with hope in their heart, only to find themselves caught in a southern system of labor exploitation and racial hierarchy at Sunnyside Plantation. We heard how they walked away, how they refused to remain silent or invisible. And in the hills of Washington County, they built Tontitown, a place where song and faith, food, and family could once again take root. And through Emily's grandfather's stories of grape harvests and wedding songs, we began to see how that belonging was passed down one generation at a time. But we are left with questions that stretch beyond Tontitown. Why were these immigrants seen as outsiders, while others, like my own great-great-grandfather from Germany, were quickly folded into the American story? What made one group's labor disposable and another's dignified? And how much of that story still plays out today in who picks our food, who is asked to prove they belong, and whose histories we teach or ignore? This episode reminds us that immigration has never been a single story. It has been shaped by power, by geography, and by race, and by those who get remembered. It invites each of us, especially those whose families were given the benefit of the doubt, to sit with that tension, to ask what stories we carry and what responsibilities come with them. In our coming episodes, we're going to continue to move through these complex, layered, and often difficult stories because they reveal the beginnings of our region, the sense of place and belonging that someone finds or doesn't find, and the willingness to thrive even under the hardest of circumstances. I want to say thank you for listening, and thank you for being the most important part of what our community is becoming. This is The Underview, an exploration in the shaping of our place.